One day in August, a man disappeared. He had simply set out for the seashore on a holiday, scarcely half a day away by train, and nothing more was ever heard of him. Investigation by the police and inquiries in the newspaper had both proved fruitless. Of course, missing persons are not really uncommon. According to the statistics, several hundred disappearances are reported every year. Moreover, the proportion of those found again is unexpectedly small. Murders or accidents always leave some clear piece of evidence, and the motives for kidnapping are normally ascertainable. But if the instance does not come under such heading, clues, and this is especially true in the case of missing persons, are extremely difficult to come by. Many disappearances, for example, may be described as simple escape. In the case of this man, also, the clues were negligible. Though his general destination was known, there had never been no report from the area that a body had been discovered. By its very nature, it was inconceivable that his work involved some secret for which he might have been abducted. His quite normal behavior had not given the slightest hint that he intended to vanish. Naturally, everyone at first imagined that a woman was involved, but his wife, or at least the woman he lived with, announced that the object of his trip had been to collect insect specimens. The police investigators and his colleagues felt vaguely disappointed. The insect bottle and net were hardly a feint for a one-away trip with a girl. Then, too, a station employee at S had remembered a man getting off the train who looked like a mountain climber, and carried, slung across his shoulders, a canteen and a wooden box, which he took to be a painting set. The man had been alone, quite alone, the employee said, so speculation about a girl was groundless. The theory had been advanced that the man, tired of life, had committed suicide. One of his colleagues, who was an amateur psychoanalyst, held to this view. He claimed that in a grown man, enthusiasm for such a useless pastime as collecting insects was evidence enough of a mental quirk. Even in children, unusual preoccupation with insect collecting frequently indicates an Oedipus complex. In order to compensate for his unsatisfied desires, the child enjoys sticking pins into insects, which he need never fear will escape. And the fact that he does not leave off once he has grown up is quite definitely a sign that the condition has become worse. Thus, it is far from accidental that entomologists frequently have an acute desire for acquisitions, and that they are extremely reclusive, kleptomaniac, homosexual. From this point to suicide out of weariness with the world is but a step. As a matter of fact, there are even some collectors who are attracted by the potassium cyanide in their bottles rather than by the collecting itself, and no matter how they try, they are quite incapable of washing their hands of the business. Indeed, the man had not once confided his interests to anyone, and this would seem to be proof that he realized they were rather dubious. Yet, since no body had actually been discovered, all of these ingenious speculations were groundless. 7 years had passed without anyone learning the truth, and so, in compliance with Section 30 of the Civil Code, the man had been pronounced dead. One August afternoon, a man stood in the railroad station at S. He wore a gray peaked hat, and the cuffs of his trousers were tucked into his stockings. A canteen and a large wooden box were slung over his shoulders. He seemed about to set out on a mountain climbing expedition. Yet there were no mountains worth climbing in the immediate vicinity. Indeed, The guard who took his ticket at the gate looked at him quizzically after he passed through. The man showed no hesitancy as he entered the bus standing in front of the station and took a seat in the back. The bus route led away from the mountains. The man stayed on the bus to the end of the run. When he got off, the landscape was a mixture of hillocks and hollows. The lowlands were rice paddies that had been divided into narrow strips, while among them slightly elevated fields planted with persimmon trees were scattered about like islands. The man passed through a village and continued walking in the direction of the seashore. The soil gradually became whitish and dry. After a time, there were no more houses, only straggling clumps of pine. Then the soil changed to a fine sand that clung to his feet. Now and again, clumps of dry grass cast shadows in hollows in the sand, as if by mistake. There was occasionally a meager plot of eggplants, the size of a straw mat, but of human shadows there was not a trace. The sea, toward which he was headed, lay beyond. For the first time the man stopped. He wiped the perspiration from his face with his sleeve and gazed around. With deliberation, he opened the wooden box, and from the top drawer took out several pieces of pole that had been bundled together. He assembled them into a handle and attached an insect net to one end. Then he began to walk again, striking the clumps of grass with the bottom of the shaft. The smell of the sea enveloped the sands. Some time went by, but the sea still could not be seen. Perhaps the hilly terrain obstructed the view. The unchanging landscape stretched endlessly on. Then, suddenly, the perspective broadened, and a hamlet came into sight. It was a commonplace, rather poor village, whose roofs, weighted down with stones, lay clustered around a high fire tower. Some of the roofs were shingled with black tile, others were of zinc, painted red. A zinc-roofed building at the hamlet's single crossroad seemed to be the meeting-house of a fishermen's cooperative. Beyond there were probably more dunes, and the sea. Still, the hamlet was spread out to an unexpected extent. There were some fertile patches, but the soil consisted mostly of dry white sand. There were fields of potatoes and peanuts, and the odor of domestic animals mingled with that of the sea. A pile of broken shells formed a white mound at the side of the clay and sand road, which was as hard as cement. As the man passed down the street, children were playing in the empty lot in front of the cooperative. Some old men were sitting on the sagging veranda, repairing their nets, and thin-haired women were gathered in front of the single general store. All movement ceased for a moment as they looked curiously at him, but the man paid no attention. Sand and insects were all that concerned him. However, the size of the village was not the only surprising thing. Contrary to what one would expect, the road was gradually rising. Since it led towards the sea, it would be more natural for it to descend. Could he have misread the map? He tried questioning a young village girl who was passing by just then, but she lowered her eyes, and acting as if she had not heard a thing, hurried on. Yet the pile of shells, the fishing nets, and the color of the sand told him that certainly the sea lay nearby. There was really nothing yet that foretold danger. The road began to rise more and more abruptly. More and more it became just sand. But, curiously enough, the areas where the houses stood were not the slightest bit higher. The road alone rose, while the hamlet itself continued to remain level. No, it was not only the road. The areas between the buildings were rising at the same rate. In a sense, then, the whole village seemed to have become a rising slope with only the buildings left on their original level. The impression became more striking as he went along. At length, all the houses seemed to be sunk into hollows scooped in the sand. The surface of the sand stood higher than the rooftops. The successive rows of houses sank deeper and deeper into the depressions. The slope suddenly steepened and must have been at least 65 feet down to the tops of the houses. What in heaven's name could it be like to live there? He thought in amazement, peering down into one of the holes. As he circled around the edge, he was suddenly struck by a biting wind that choked his breath in his throat. The view abruptly opened up, and the turbid, foaming sea licked at the shore below. He was standing on the crest of the dunes that had been his objective. The side of the dunes that faced the sea and received the monsoon winds rose abruptly, but straggling clumps of scrub grass grew in places where the incline was not as steep. The man looked back over his shoulder at the village, and he could see that the great holes, which grew deeper as they approached the crest of the ridge, extended in several ranks toward the center. The village, resembling the cross section of a beehive, lay sprawled over the dunes, or rather, the dunes lay sprawled over the village. Either way, it was a disturbing and unsettling landscape, but it was enough that he had reached his destination, the dunes. The man drank some water from his canteen and filled his lungs with air, and the air which had seemed so clear felt rough in his throat. The man intended to collect insects that lived in the dunes. Of course, dune insects are small and soberly colored, but he was a dedicated collector, and his eye was not tempted by anything like butterflies or dragonflies. Such collectors do not aspire to decking out their specimen boxes with gaudy examples, nor are they particularly interested in classification or in raw materials for Chinese medicines. The true entomologist's pleasure is much simpler, more direct, that of discovering a new type. When this happens, the discoverer's name appears in the illustrated encyclopedias of entomology, appended to the technical Latin name of the newly found insect, and there, perhaps, it is preserved for something less than eternity. His efforts are crowned with success if his name is perpetuated in the memory of his fellow men by being associated with an insect. The smaller, unobstructive insects, with their innumerable strains, offer many opportunities for new discoveries. For a long time, the man had also been on the lookout for double-winged flies, especially common house flies, which people find so repulsive. Of course, the various types of flies are unbelievably numerous, and since all entomologists seem to think pretty much alike, they have pursued their investigations into the eighth rare mutant found in Japan almost to completion. Perhaps mutants are so abundant because the fly's environment is too close to man's. He had best begin by observing environment. That there were many environmental variations simply indicated a high degree of adaptability among flies, didn't it? At this discovery, he jumped with joy. His concept might not be altogether bad. The fact that the fly should great adaptability meant that it could be at home even in unfavorable environments in which other insects cannot live. For example, a desert where all other living things perished. From then on, he began to manifest an interest in sand, and soon this interest bore fruit. One day, in the dry river bed near his house, he discovered a smallish light pink insect which resembled a double-winged garden beetle, Cicindela japonica mochulski. It is common knowledge, of course, that the garden beetle presents many variations in color and design, but The form of the front legs, on the other hand, varies very little. In fact, the front legs of the sheath wing beetle constitute an important criterion for its classification, and the second joint on the front legs of the insect that had caught the man's eye did indeed have striking characteristics. Generally speaking, the front legs of the beetle family are black, slender, and agile. However, the front legs of this one seemed to be covered with a stout sheath. They were round, almost chubby, and cream colored. Of course, they may have been smeared with pollen. One might even assume some sort of condition, the presence of hair, for example, which would cause the pollen to adhere to the legs. If his observations were correct, he had certainly made a most important discovery, but unfortunately he had let it escape. He had been too excited, and besides, the beetle's pattern of flight was confusing. It flew away, and then, as if to say, "Catch me," it turned and waited. When he approached it cautiously, it flew away again, turned around, and waited.